beneath the headlines, behind the timelines, there is a story no one wants you to find. Welcome to some unapproved thinking, where forgotten truths, buried patterns, and invisible systems rise to the surface. You weren't crazy. You were just early. Let's begin.
You know, it's funny how history has a way of repeating itself, or at least echoing through the corridors of time, right? Last time, we touched on the symbolism of the Statue of Liberty and how there's often more to our historical touchstones than meets the eye. But today, let's dive into something that at first glance doesn't seem to connect at all: the sinking of the Titanic and the formation of the Federal Reserve. You've been told the Titanic sank because of an iceberg. You've been told the Federal Reserve was created to stabilize the economy. Both stories are missing the same people, the same names. The same night, on April 14th, 1912, 7 men were dining in first-class cabins aboard the RMS Titanic. Not passengers, owners, bankers. Within hours, the ship went down. Within months, their competitors were dead or mysteriously missing from history altogether. 3 years later, the Federal Reserve was born. The official story calls this coincidence. But coincidence doesn't require 5 senators to vote it into law at midnight on Christmas Eve. Coincidence doesn't require the richest men in America to have suddenly agreed on anything ever again. This is some unapproved thinking.
Thank you to our sponsor, the Dark Horse Entrepreneur Podcast. Unlock your potential with the Dark Horse Entrepreneur AI Escape Plan, the podcast empowering hardworking parents to break free from the 9-to-5 grind through AI-powered side hustles. Check them out at darkhorseentrepreneur.com. Now back to the show.
Here's what you're not supposed to notice. The Titanic sank on a Sunday. The Federal Reserve was signed into law on a Friday. Both were inevitable. Both were planned. Let's start with what actually happened that night, not what was written in the newspapers. On April 10th, 1912, the Titanic departed Southampton with 2,224 people on board. The ship had been built by Harland and Wolff in Belfast, the most advanced shipyard in the world. Among the passengers were J.P. Morgan, the most powerful banker in the world, and his inner circle. Morgan had reserved a suite aboard the ship, but canceled 2 days before departure. No explanation, no reschedule. He simply wasn't there. What's worth knowing is that Morgan didn't just book a ticket. He owned the ship. His company, International Mercantile Marine, had acquired White Star Line years earlier. Morgan owned the vessel, and he chose not to board it. But 4 men who worked for him were 4 men who knew every detail of his financial empire. 4 men who were about to testify against him in Congress about the money supply. The ship was the largest moving object humanity had ever built. Unsinkable, they said. 16 watertight compartments, the latest wireless technology. When the iceberg hit at 11:47 p.m., Captain Smith made a choice. He radioed nearby ships. He knew how many lifeboats were on board. He knew the math. There weren't enough lifeboats for 2,224 people. There were enough for 1,178. Exactly 710 people survived. The numbers don't add up. They never do when you're looking for the truth. What matters is who was among the 1,512 who didn't survive. Benjamin Guggenheim, owner of the Guggenheim mining empire. Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store. John Jacob Astor IV, the richest man on the ship, worth $87 million in 1912 money. That's roughly $2.4 billion today. Astor had recently published a book about wealth distribution. He called for a progressive tax system. He questioned whether bankers should have unlimited power. He was planning to testify in Congress. He didn't make it. His body was never recovered. But his fortune was, his will transferred everything to his son, an 18-year-old boy with no experience in finance. Convenient. And then there's the 4th man, Thomas Andrews. He wasn't a passenger. He was Harland and Wolff's chief designer, the man who had overseen the Titanic's construction from the first rivet to the final fitting. The only person on Earth who knew every inch of that vessel. When survivors were interviewed, they said Andrews spent the final hours going from cabin to cabin, calculating exactly how long the ship would stay afloat. He knew the timeline. He knew when the water would reach certain compartments. He knew when hope would end. He was the keeper of the ship's secrets, and those secrets went down with him. Also, notably absent from the casualty list, Bruce Ismay, the chairman of White Star Line. Ismay boarded a lifeboat and survived. He was the man responsible for the ship's operations, the man who, by most accounts, had pressured the crew to maintain speed through iceberg waters. He lived. The ship's designer died. That detail was never adequately explained. The wireless operators kept sending distress signals. The nearest ship, the Californian, was only 10 miles away. Its radio operator was awake. He heard the Titanic's calls, but the captain had already gone to bed. The operator didn't wake him. A decision, a single human choice that meant the difference between rescue and catastrophe. Later, there were questions, investigations, but the operator's story never changed, and neither did the captain's silence. Here's where the pattern starts to emerge: control through information asymmetry. Some people knew, most didn't. But to understand the Federal Reserve connection, you have to go back 2 years before the Titanic ever left port, to November 1910, to a private island off the coast of Georgia, 5,900 acres sitting 10 miles off the coast of Georgia, called Jekyll Island. 6 men arrived separately, in secret, using only first names so the servants couldn't identify them later. Among them, Senator Nelson Aldrich, the most powerful Republican in the Senate and the chairman of the National Monetary Commission; Paul Warburg, a German-born banker representing the Rothschild banking interests of Europe; Frank Vanderlip, president of National City Bank; Henry Davison, J.P. Morgan's senior partner; A. Piatt Andrew, assistant secretary of the Treasury. And they had one purpose: to draft the legislation that would become the Federal Reserve Act. They called their proposal the Aldrich Plan. It was a blueprint for a private central bank disguised as a public institution. The National Monetary Commission, the official government body supposedly studying the banking system, had already laid the groundwork. But the real work happened at Jekyll Island, in private, over 9 days, with no press and no record. G. Edward Griffin documented this meeting in extraordinary detail in his book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, which remains the foundational text on how the Federal Reserve was actually designed. The men who drafted it weren't elected. They weren't accountable. They were bankers, writing banking law for bankers. Now consider the timing. The Jekyll Island meeting, November 1910. The Titanic sinking, April 1912. The Federal Reserve Act signed into law, December 1913. 3 events, 3 years, 1 outcome. Fast forward to 1913. The Federal Reserve Act is being written, or rather being repackaged, because the draft already existed. Congressman Charles Lindbergh Sr., yes, the aviator's father, stood on the House floor and said this exact thing: the financial system has been turned over to the Federal Reserve, a private monopoly, and the people have been tricked into a valueless system. He wasn't alone. There were others who understood what was happening, but their voices were drowned out. The bill, also known as the Owen Glass Act, passed on December 23, 1913, and President Wilson signed it 5 days before Christmas, when Congress was already in recess, when newspapers were focused on holiday stories, when most Americans were looking anywhere but at what their government was actually doing. The Aldrich Plan had technically failed, but its architecture survived almost entirely intact, just under a new name. Now connect the names. The men who died on the Titanic had one thing in common, according to this theory. They all questioned the existing financial system. They all had the power and the platform to potentially challenge it. Their deaths weren't just tragedies. They were, if you follow the logic, eliminations. When you remove the opposition and replace them with compliant successors, you don't call that a conspiracy. You call it progress. But here's the part that makes you uncomfortable. You can't prove any of this. Not because it isn't true, but because proof requires access to documents that were sealed, destroyed, or never created in the first place. That's the design. That's the trap. By making the evidence impossible to find, you make the conspiracy impossible to disprove. And by making it impossible to disprove, you ensure that anyone who questions it will be labeled as irrational. The Federal Reserve wasn't created to stabilize the economy. It was created to replace the old financial system with a new one, a system where power was concentrated in private hands, disguised as a public institution. The Federal Reserve isn't part of the government. It's a private corporation. Congress can't fully audit it. The president can't control it. It prints the money that everyone uses, and it answers to no one but its own board of governors. Think about the elegance of it. You remove the men who understand the system well enough to oppose you. You wait 3 years, long enough for the initial shock to fade. You wait until a new generation of politicians is in power, men who didn't live through the Titanic disaster, who didn't know the old guard. Then you introduce your new system as the obvious solution to the problem that never existed. The public was never asked. Congress was barely paying attention. The deal was already done, drafted at Jekyll Island 3 years earlier, before most people even knew there was a deal to be made. The Titanic's maiden voyage was supposed to prove that humanity had conquered nature. Instead, it proved something darker, that the most powerful men in the world were willing to sacrifice thousands of lives to consolidate their power, and they got away with it. No trials, no accountability, just a change in the historical record. Newspapers reported it as an accident. Insurance paid out. Life went on. The next generation forgot why they should be angry. Within 20 years, the Federal Reserve had such complete control over the money supply that the Great Depression became inevitable. When the stock market crashed in 1929, the Federal Reserve had the power to prevent it. Instead, they did nothing. They let the economy collapse. Millions of people lost everything. And the blame fell on everyone except the one institution that could have prevented it. The one institution that had no accountability, no transparency, no one to answer to, except they did answer to someone. They answered to the Board of Governors. Men like Benjamin Strong, who had been at the center of the Jekyll Island network and later served as the first governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Strong met secretly with European bankers to coordinate monetary policy. His conversations were never recorded. His decisions were never questioned. He shaped the financial reality of an entire nation without a single vote being cast. The Titanic was the last gasp of the old financial order. The men who died on that ship represented an older, more distributed system of wealth. They were competitors who checked each other's power. When they died, a vacuum opened. The Federal Reserve was the solution to that vacuum. One centralized institution, one system, one point of control, designed in secret at Jekyll Island and signed into law when no one was watching. You can verify this. The congressional testimony exists. The Jekyll Island meeting is documented. Even the participants eventually admitted it happened. G. Edward Griffin built an entire archive around it. The question is whether you're willing to look or whether you've already accepted the official story because it's easier. Easier doesn't mean true. Easier means you don't have to think about what it would mean if you were wrong about your entire financial system. Here's the final piece that most people miss. The people who know the truth about the Federal Reserve's origins don't deny it. They don't argue against it. They simply don't talk about it. They control the conversation by controlling the narrators. They fund the official histories. They sit on the boards of the universities that teach the official histories. They ensure that the people who might investigate these connections are too busy, too poor, or too afraid to actually do so. The Titanic sank into the Atlantic Ocean. Its passengers sank into history, and the Federal Reserve rose from the waters of their silence, drafted at Jekyll Island, voted through on a winter's night, signed while the country slept, a new god in a new temple, built on the bones of the old order. The question you should ask isn't whether the connection exists. The question is why you were never told about it. This has been some unapproved thinking. Tracy, out. Next.
If this story didn't sit right with you, good. You're not here to be comforted. You're here to see what others overlook. Thanks for exploring some unapproved thinking. Learn more at someunapprovedthinking.com. New episodes drop weekly. Subscribe, share, and keep questioning, because the pattern's still playing out, and next time, we're going deeper.